They say the wind in Dagger Ridge carries voices, fragments of stories caught in the tumbleweed, echoing across red rock and silence. You've probably heard the tale, how this dust-bitten town once stood still while the Crenshaw boys rode in to claim what wasn't theirs. Maybe you've even heard about the diamonds. But what you ain't heard is who he really was. It starts, as most legends do, with something that didn't look like much. The town was a scar on the edge of nowhere, one long, crooked main street flanked by weather-beaten buildings, leaning like drunkards into the wind. The canyon walls, burnt red by the sun, loomed close enough to cast early shadows and make a man feel watched. Dust never settled. It danced, swirled, and painted the town in shades of grit and time. It wasn't a place you stayed unless you had something to hide or nothing left to lose. Miriam Grace had been both. Her shop sat between the shuttered saloon and the old saddlery, its front window etched with fading gold lettering, Grace timepieces and jewels. No one remembered when she arrived, only that she had. Her late husband, Thomas Grace, had been a gem merchant, smooth-talking and sharp-dressed, dead 3 winters now. Some said robbery, others whispered betrayal. But Miriam remained, never remarried, never left. She wore black every day since, a color that seemed to claim her as much as she claimed it. Her gray hair was always pinned in a tight bun, and her face, though lined, held no fragility. Her hands, fine, delicate, could coax the soul out of a broken watch, and her eyes, sharp and glinting like sapphires, saw more than they let on. Children dared each other to run past her window. Men kept polite, nervous distances. Women wondered aloud why a widow needed 3 locks on her back door and a bolt beneath the counter. But no one asked her directly. You didn't ask questions of a woman like Miriam Grace. It was a Monday, hot, windless, thick with the scent of dust and distant sage, when word came in. The Crenshaw boys were riding south. 5 of them, maybe 6, armed and dangerous, wanted in 3 territories. The youngest, Flint, was said to enjoy lighting fires more than robbing banks. The oldest, Rafe, had put a bullet through a sheriff's badge clean enough to hang it back on the corpse. And somewhere along their trail, rumor had it, they picked up a name, Grace. The townsfolk didn't need much more to get nervous. By nightfall, Dagger Ridge was locked down tighter than a nun's diary. Curtains drawn, candles snuffed, rifles cleaned and cocked. At the saloon, the barkeep poured drinks for no one, polishing glasses more for comfort than necessity. In hushed voices, the whispers turned to the widow. They say Thomas Grace left her something. Diamonds. Hidden, maybe buried. Hell, if that gang's coming for Am, she better not put up a fight. Think she's got protection. Protection? She's got a damn wall of clocks. But some knew better. There'd been talk years back of strangers visiting the shop late at night, never entering by the front, of locked drawers in the back room, of shipments that never went through the post. That night, as the town held its breath, her shop remained lit. A single oil lamp glowed behind the window, casting golden shadows across ticking clocks and gleaming rings. Miriam sat at her workbench, loop to eye, repairing a cracked pocket watch. Her hands moved slow and steady, as though the world outside hadn't changed in 100 years. When the knock came at the door, she didn't jump. It was soft, almost respectful. 3 taps. She set the watch down gently and walked to the door, unbolting it, but keeping the chain hooked. A sliver of moonlight fell across the figure outside. He was old. Worn boots, dusty trousers, a threadbare coat hanging off shoulders too broad for his frame. He leaned heavily on a knotted cane, his back hunched like a question mark. A wide brim had shadowed most of his face, but his voice, when it came, was dry as tinder. "Evenin', ma'am. Heard you might be needin' help round the shop." Miriam eyed him for a long beat, then unhooked the chain. "I didn't send for anyone." "No, ma'am," he said, "but I figured better to knock than to break in." A flicker of amusement crossed her lips, then vanished. "You're not from here." "Not lately." She stepped aside. "You can sweep floors. That's all I need." He nodded, stepping in slowly, his cane tapping softly against the worn wooden floor. His eyes scanned the walls of ticking clocks, the glass cases of rings and cufflinks, the heavy steel door behind the counter. He said nothing, only removed his hat, revealing weathered skin and gray-streaked hair pulled back into a short, rough tail. "I'm Harper," he said. She didn't offer her name, just pointed to the broom by the corner and returned to her workbench. For the next hour, the only sound was the whisper of the broom against floorboards and the soft, rhythmic ticking of time. But something shifted in the air of that little shop, something neither of them spoke about, but both felt. Outside, the desert wind picked up again, and if you stood quiet enough near the edge of town, you might have heard it, more than the creak of swinging signs or the cry of coyotes. You might have heard the beginning of something, a breath before the storm. And maybe, just maybe, you'd understand. Not all diamonds glitter in the sun. Some are buried deep, waiting. The mornings in Dagger Ridge broke slow, as if even the sun thought twice before spilling its light over that dry stretch of earth. Miriam rose with it, as she always did, winding the clocks, checking the locks, setting her tools in order with methodical care. The stranger, Harper, arrived before the first bell struck. He didn't say much, just nodded, took up the broom, and moved through the shop like someone who'd already memorized the floorboard creaks. His limp slowed him, but his motions were precise, almost practiced. Like everything had weight, meaning. Miriam watched him from behind her bench, the loop perched on her eye as she soldered a cracked locket hinge. She wasn't sure why she'd let him in. Maybe because of the calm in his voice, or the stillness in his eyes. He didn't look like a drifter hungry for coin, or a fool scared of shadows. He looked like someone who had already walked through fire. By the second morning, he'd fixed the back door's hinge without being asked. By the third, he'd sorted her loose gears into perfect rows, smallest to largest, like he'd handled such things before. On the fourth, when her fingers cramped up halfway through repairing an old train conductor's watch, he took the tool gently from her hand and, without a word, loosened the jammed escapement with the delicate turn of a wrist. The gears clicked into rhythm like they'd never been broken. She blinked. "That's not something you learn sweeping floors." Harper said nothing, only gave a faint shrug and handed the watch back. That night, after she'd locked up, Miriam poured herself a glass of rye and stood at the back window, watching the town settle into quiet. The wind murmured low over the rooftops and behind the mountains, the sky bruised purple. She sipped and thought of Thomas. He'd been a dreamer, tall, silver-tongued, with an eye for gemstones and a weakness for deals that promised too much. They'd married late, after years of him wandering trade routes and her fixing watches in San Marcos. He promised to settle, promised safety, but the road never quite left his bones. The day he rode out for the last time, he'd kissed her cheek, left a bag of uncut stones in the cellar, and said he'd be back before the next full moon. He never was. The telegram came 2 weeks later. Robbery gone bad, somewhere near Copper Hollow. Nothing left but a blood-stained saddlebag. Official story said bandits, but Miriam had counted the holes in his coat when it was returned. Clean shots. Too clean. And a week before, she'd seen him whispering to a man from town with a snake-oil grin and eyes that never stopped moving. She never proved it, but she never forgot. The bell above the door rang late the next afternoon. Harper turned before she did, instinctively stepping to one side as the door swung open and wind tore through the shop like a knife. The glass case by the register exploded with a pop, shards tinkling across the floor like falling stars. Miriam ducked, heart hammering. A rock rolled to her feet, paper tied around it with twine. She picked it up with careful fingers and unwrapped it. The note was scrawled in charcoal. "Give 'em over, or we burn it down. CB." She stood slowly, gaze sweeping the street. No one outside, just blowing dust and empty porches. Harper picked up the biggest shard of glass and turned it between his fingers like a weapon. He didn't ask what the note meant. Didn't have to. She met his eyes. "They're coming." He nodded, sooner than expected. That night, Miriam didn't light the front lamp. She bolted the shutters, locked the front and back doors, then lit 2 candles and carried them to the workshop at the rear of the shop. Harper followed in silence, his cane tapping quietly behind her. She set 1 candle on the workbench and pulled a small iron key from a chain around her neck. She knelt, her skirt rustling against the old boards. For a moment she hesitated, then pressed the key into the floor, finding the tiny groove only she knew. There was a click. She lifted a square of floorboard with both hands, revealing a shallow hollow beneath. From within, she drew out a velvet pouch the color of old wine. She placed it on the bench, untied it, and opened the mouth wide. Diamonds. Dozens. Some no bigger than a tear, others like frostbitten grapes. Raw, uncut, glinting fire beneath candlelight. The pouch exhaled the scent of dry velvet and secrets. Harper stared, expression unreadable. They weren't his, she said softly. Not entirely. Some he traded for. Others he acquired through less honest men. But they're all that's left. Why keep them? She paused. Because I want them to burn for what they did. And because I know they think I'm too weak to stop them. Harper stepped closer, leaned on his cane. You're not. She looked up at him, shadows dancing across her face. You've done more than sweep floors, haven't you? A long silence. He didn't nod, didn't confirm. Just said, I know men like the Crenshaws. I've watched what they do to towns like this. They'll come at night. Fast. Loud. They'll hurt who they need to until they find what they want. Miriam's jaw set. Then we don't let them. For the first time, a glimmer of something flickered in Harper's eyes. Not quite a smile, but the memory of one. Outside, the wind howled louder. Clocks ticked in unison, hundreds of them, each whispering the same thing. Time was running out. The sun bled slowly over the mesa, igniting the sky in hues of crimson and gold. Long shadows stretched across the scrublands as Dagger Ridge held its breath. The silence was unnatural, not peaceful, but wound-tight like a trigger pulled halfway. Doors were bolted, curtains drawn. Eyes peeked through slats in wood. The air was thick with dust and dread. And then came the riders. 5 of them, dark silhouettes cut against the blaze of morning, riding hard from the canyon trail. Dust rose behind them like smoke from a battlefield. Leather creaked, rifles glinted, and the sound of hooves thudded into the town's chest like a warning drum. At the front, tall and lean, rode Rafe Crenshaw, black coat flaring behind him like wings, a silver tooth flashing when he grinned. No one stepped outside to greet them. The sheriff, folks noticed, had ridden off the evening before. Something about official business in another county. No one believed it, but no one challenged it. Dagger Ridge had seen lawmen break before. The Crenshaw gang halted in front of graced timepieces and jewels. Rafe dismounted slow, savoring the stillness, letting the town see him. He ran a hand through his thick, wind-blown hair and cracked his neck like a man getting ready for a dance. Behind the glass window, Miriam stood. She wore black again, always did, but her posture was straight, her chin high. The pouch of diamonds was hidden, locked inside the workshop safe beneath her bench. Harper was nowhere in sight. The door burst inward with the force of a kicked boot, the bell above it shattering as it slammed against the wall. The gang poured in, fled first, wild-eyed and jittery, followed by Kane and Doolin, Muscles and Malice. Rafe strolled in last, brushing dust from his coat. Miriam didn't move. Well now, Rafe drawled, sweeping his gaze across the shop. Ain't this a quaint little nest? Flint knocked over a display case with a laugh, glass and watches crashing to the floor. Kane grabbed a wall clock and smashed it against a pillar, the ticking silenced in a heartbeat. Doolin leered as he stomped behind the counter, looking for locks, safes, secrets. Rafe stepped up to Miriam, too close, breath stinking of whiskey and blood. Let's keep this easy, darling. We know what you're hiding. You just hand it over, and maybe we don't burn your pretty little bones to cinders. Her voice didn't waver. You'll find nothing here but broken time and hard steel. He laughed, then slapped her. It echoed like a shot. She staggered back, but didn't fall. Search everything, he barked, as the gang tore through the shop, ripping drawers, smashing tools, overturning shelves. Rafe watched her, waiting for fear, but it didn't come. Then something changed. A sound, small, sharp, clicked through the room. Doolin turned, confused. Kane stepped back from a cabinet, his hand falling to his revolver. From the back room, Through the open door, Harper emerged. No limp, no cane. He walked with a straight spine and eyes like tempered steel. The duster coat he wore flared slightly as his arm lifted, and from within it came the glint of polished metal. A single-shot pistol. He fired before the gang even knew what they were seeing. Kane went down with a hole between the eyes, collapsing like a dropped sack. Doolan spun to shoot, but the second bullet caught him in the throat, cutting his scream short. Flint scrambled backward, crashing into a shelf of gears and screws. Rafe didn't move, just stared, shock playing on his face. Harper stood still, the smoke rising from his pistol like ghost breath. His face didn't show rage, only certainty. The kind men wear when they've come too far to turn back. Rafe sneered, "You're supposed to be dead." Harper's voice was gravel. "You tried." Recognition swept the room like wildfire. Marshal Elias Harper, the lawman who'd vanished after his wife and son were murdered in a border raid, who'd hunted bandits across 3 states, who disappeared after the Crenshaw name was whispered in connection to the killing. He wasn't a ghost. He was right here, and he'd come to finish what time had started. Miriam stared at him. This man who had swept her floors, oiled her gears, moved with silence and watched everything. "You knew," she whispered. Harper didn't look at her. "I followed them for years. They led me here." Rafe moved fast then, grabbing Miriam by the arm and yanking her in front of him like a shield. Flint scrambled to his feet, eyes darting for a back door. Harper froze, gun empty, jaw tight. "Drop it," Rafe hissed, pressing his pistol to Miriam's temple. "Or I paint the wall with her brains." Harper's fingers twitched, but he let the gun fall. Flint kicked it aside and grabbed a length of rope, hands shaking. Rafe dragged Miriam backward toward the shattered door, using her body like cover. The town watched through windows. No one moved. No one dared. Rafe grinned. "Should have stayed dead, Marshal." Harper took a step forward, but Rafe was already gone, yanking Miriam through the door, mounting his horse one-handed, pulling her up in front of him. The gang, what was left of it, galloped hard out of town, vanishing into the morning haze. Dust swallowed them like they'd never been there. Harper stood in the wreckage of the shop, staring at the door, at the silence they left behind. The smoke from his shots still lingered. Time ticked again, faint and relentless. And the war wasn't over. Not yet. The canyons breathed heat and silence, their crimson walls swallowing sound and echoing dread. Dust trailed behind Harper like a ghost as he rode alone into the maze of rock and bone. The sun hung low, bleeding light across the buttes, his horse panting beneath him, hooves striking sparks off stone. Age bent his bones and pain sang in his joints, but his grip on the reins never loosened. He rode like a man with nothing left to lose, and one thing left to do. Far ahead, beyond the winding trails and shadowed crevices, the Crenshaw gang holed up in an ancient mining cave, the entrance half-collapsed, hidden from sky and man alike. Rafe paced like a wolf just inside the mouth, pistol always close, eyes on the narrow path beyond. Flint sat nearby, twitchy and pale, cradling a shotgun like it was a child. And Miriam, still in black, still unbroken, was bound at the wrists, seated against the stone with her back straight and her eyes sharp. She hadn't screamed, hadn't begged. She'd watched, and she spoke. "You know he's coming," she said, her voice calm clear. "He doesn't stop." Flint shot her a look. "We got the high ground. He's one man. He's not here to arrest you," she said, leaning forward just slightly. "He's here to bury you." Rafe scowled. "She's trying to get in your head. Don't listen." But Flint's fingers trembled, just a little tighter around the shotgun's grip. Miriam turned to him. "He knows your names. Knows where you sleep. He didn't come to Dagger Ridge for diamonds. He came for you." Flint stood suddenly and stalked away, muttering to himself. Rafe glared at her, then leaned down close. "You're clever," he growled. "Too clever. Think that'll save you." She met his gaze. It already has. Dusk fell like a shroud, and the canyon turned to shadow. Harper moved slow, deliberate, weaving between ancient boulders and narrow ledges. He knew the terrain, had ridden it once long ago in pursuit of rustlers and killers. Now it served him again, a silent ally. He dismounted a mile from the cave and let the horse go. On foot, he was quieter, leaner, harder to follow. He laid his traps with the patience of a watchmaker. A loose boulder balanced above a choke point, a tripwire across a ravine path, a buried spike beneath the canyon sand. Tools of a man who had waited too long to rush now. The first scream came just after moonrise. Flint, drawn by a noise he couldn't ignore, took a wrong step and vanished in a rain of rock. The avalanche buried him before he had time to shout a name. Kane, one of the last loyal ones, rushed out with a lantern to look. A rifle cracked. He hit the ground and didn't rise. Now only Rafe remained. And Miriam. The cave grew colder. A fire crackled weakly in the back, casting jagged shadows across the wall. Rafe paced tighter circles. His pistol hand shook just once before he caught himself. "You know what he is," Miriam said softly. "You remember what you did." Rafe turned slowly. He was a badge. A ghost. We killed his family, but we left him breathing. That was the mistake. Outside, the wind whispered. Then silence. And then the quiet snap of a snare. Rafe bolted to the entrance. Harper stood there in the dark, framed by moonlight, one hand raised. "Empty. Only you left, Rafe." Rafe lifted his gun, fired. Missed. Harper moved like a memory, close now. Fast despite the limp that had returned with the pain. He crashed into Rafe, knocking the gun away. The two of them tumbling into the dust. Fists. Elbows. Grit and blood. Rafe swung wild, clipped Harper's jaw. Harper responded with a blow to the ribs that sent the wind out of the outlaw. They grappled, rolled. Two old enemies bound by time, revenge, and something darker. Rafe got on top, hands at Harper's throat. "Should have died with your family," he snarled. Harper surged up, broke the grip, slammed Rafe's head into stone. Once, twice, 3 times, until the man stopped moving. Breathless, bloodied, Harper crawled back into the cave. Miriam still sat there, watching. He fell beside her, chest heaving, face streaked with sweat and red. "I thought you were done for," she whispered. He smiled just barely. "Not yet." She looked at him, really looked, then leaned close. "You were never just a floor sweeper." Harper closed his eyes. The cave was quiet now, save for the wind curling through the canyon mouth and the distant sound of clocks still ticking in his memory. The smoke had barely cleared from the canyon when the whispers began. By the time Miriam and Harper returned to Dagger Ridge, bloodied, bruised, and silent as dusk, half the town had already gathered at the edge of Main Street, eyes wide, mouths shut. No one moved. No one asked questions. Harper walked beside her. His limp returned, but slower now, heavier. Dust clung to his coat like old sin, and a torn cloth was tied tight around his shoulder. He didn't look left or right. He just stared forward, as if the town itself were nothing more than another bend in the trail. The next morning, he was gone. Some swore they saw him before sunrise, standing by the train depot, a silver-handled cane in one hand and a new revolver resting on his hip. Others said he never made it out of the canyons, that he bled out beneath the cliffs and was buried by wind and time. One child claimed she saw him vanish into the fog beyond the hills, his coat flaring like wings. No one ever found a grave. When the sheriff finally returned, hat cocked low and excuses trailing from his tongue, he found a town that no longer needed him. He strutted into the saloon, declared justice had been done under his watch, but his words rang hollow. The barkeep didn't pour him a drink. The piano didn't play, and no one cared what badge he wore on his chest. Back at the shop, Miriam didn't replace the broken front window. Instead, she pulled the benches closer to the sun, let the breeze run freely through the store. She fixed what was salvageable, swept what wasn't. The clocks, once shattered, now ticked again, one by one, methodically, precisely. Each attribute to time survived, and she opened the velvet pouch, not to hide the diamonds, but to spend them. One found its way to the blacksmith, whose boy had never worn shoes that fit. Another was melted down and sent west, stitched into a letter and delivered to a widow in Iron Bluff, whose husband had once crossed the Crenshaws and died for it. That diamond paid for her roof, her mule, and her daughter's wedding dress. Miriam took none for herself, save one. It sat quietly in her brooch now, nestled in a silver frame that caught the morning light, just so. Not flashy, not ostentatious, but sharp, perfectly cut, and faceted by her own hand. The town changed, slowly. The saloon reopened, but with softer music. The church doors stayed open longer. A school bell rang again for the first time in 2 years. No one spoke of the Crenshaw gang anymore, except in mutters to warn the next generation. But the legend that grew. Stories spread like wildfire across counties. Some said Harper had been a devil-turned-angel, a bounty hunter who once killed 20 men in a single night. Others claimed he was part Apache, that he rode with spirits and whispered to wolves. One man, drunk in a tavern 2 towns over, swore Harper didn't even use bullets, just stared into a man's eyes until the guilt crushed him. They called him the Ghost Marshal of Dagger Ridge. Miriam never corrected them. She never explained the truth, that he had been just a man, broken, quiet, grieving. A man who had once been law and lost everything to men who thought justice could be buried. She still worked the shop, still wound watches and polished rings, and greeted strangers with a nod instead of a smile. Children no longer dared each other to run past her window. Instead, they pressed their noses to the glass, trying to spot the legendary jewel rumored to sit behind the counter. A stone of fire, born in blood. One afternoon, a traveler from the north stepped inside. Young, cocky, boots too clean. He asked if she'd ever met the Ghost Marshal. She looked up from her bench, a magnifier still over one eye. "I met a man," she said. "He swept my floors. Fixed a clock no one else could." The traveler scoffed. Didn't sound like much of a legend. Miriam smiled then, just faintly. That's the thing about legends. They don't start out that way. As the traveler left, the sun dipped low behind the canyon edge. Light slanted through the broken window, caught the edge of her brooch, and scattered across the walls like tiny fires. She turned back to her work, watch gears ticking in perfect harmony, the pulse of something old and unbroken echoing through the shop. Outside, the wind picked up again, whispering through town. And if you listened real close, you might hear it say his name. Ask any old-timer in Dagger Ridge about the canyon east of the church, and they'll lean back in their chair, tilt their hat, and murmur. That's where justice got its boots dirty. Some will say it like a prayer, others like a warning, but none say it lightly. The canyon still yawns red and wide beneath the sky, and if you stand quiet long enough, the wind seems to carry more than sand. It hums with echoes of gunfire and grit and men who thought they couldn't die. The rocks remember what the town prefers to forget. Years have passed since the Crenshaw gang rode, and thinking they could take what wasn't theirs and disappear into legend. But legends, it turns out, have sharp edges. And in Dagger Ridge, they cut both ways. Miriam still works behind the counter, her hands steady, her eyes sharper than most rifles. Time hasn't touched her the way it touches others. Maybe it's the work, maybe it's something deeper. The clocks around her tick in gentle rhythm, each a heartbeat in a world that once stopped breathing. No one's seen Harper since that morning at the depot. Folks say he moved east. Others swear he died long ago, and what came through town was his ghost, riding on the last winds of revenge. One man swears he saw him in Silver Junction, limping out of a gambling house with a deck of marked cards and a grin like thunder. But even the liars in this town know better than to speak his name too loudly. Still, there's talk. Trouble rising in the north. A new gang, smaller, quieter, meaner. They don't storm through with rifles and horses. They slip in like rot, under floorboards and through the mouths of cowards. Someone burned a barn 3 counties over. Someone else lost their eldest boy on a supply run and found a black feather pinned to his saddle. And though the town pretends not to notice, there are signs. A shotgun cleaned weekly on the church steps. A deputy who trains alone at dusk, practicing with the calmness of someone who expects to miss. And in the general store, beneath the flour sacks and beans, someone keeps an old Henry rifle loaded and wrapped in oilcloth. Because legends don't keep towns safe. People do. One day, just past high noon, a girl walks into Miriam's shop. 14, maybe 15. with dust in her boots and a spark behind her eyes that won't quit. She looks around, listens to the ticking, and says, "I heard you teach folks how to fix watches." Miriam looks up from her bench, takes in the girl's wiry frame, the knuckles scraped raw from some fight she probably won, and the fire flickering behind every syllable. "I teach patience," Miriam replies. "The rest comes after." The girl doesn't blink. "I can be patient." There's a long silence. Only the clocks speak. Then Miriam sets down her loop, rises slow, and walks to the back drawer. It creaks open like a secret. Beneath the velvet trays and brass gear sets, nestled where few would ever look, lies an old revolver, well-oiled, its grip worn smooth. She lifts it gently, places it beside a rusted clock spring. "You learn patience," she says. "Then you learn precision. The rest the world teaches you." The girl nods, eyes wide, not from fear, but reverence. Not for the gun, but for the woman holding it. Outside, the wind shifts. A dust devil dances down Main Street, kicking up old echoes, hoofbeats, gunshots, a woman's defiance, and for just a breath, it feels like time folds in on itself, pulling yesterday close to tomorrow. Later, long after the girl is gone, and the sun has begun to set, Miriam sits at her bench polishing a watch no bigger than a coin. Her brooch catches the fading light, casting slivers across the shop walls. In that light, past the hum of clocks and memory, something stirs in the air, a whisper, almost. They thought they could steal her diamonds and walk away. But in Dagger Ridge, nothing that glitters escapes justice.